Okay. So how do you say hello in various parts of the world?
Hello.
Hello. Yeah, sure. Hello.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
Hola.
Hola. Yeah.
Ni hao.
Ni hao. Yeah.
안녕하세요.
Oh, you want to say that again for me?
안녕하세요.
Okay.
Oi.
Oi.
Xin chào.
Xin chao.
Namaskar.
Namaskar. Okay. Nice.
I think they covered it all.
They covered everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. No Brazilian Portuguese here.
Arigato.
Oi.
Bom dia.
Oi.
Oi. Okay.
Arigato.
Arigato. Yeah, see, good. Right? So part of getting into cross-border transactions, right? Being able to say hello, being able to figure out whether they're saying good things about you or bad things about you. So today's session.
One thing I need to add to that.
Sure.
The moment you get into India, your hello is said in a very different because of the different languages India has.
Right.
So you're looking at 27 states. 27 states are going to say hello in a different language.
Right. And I can tell you one of the most embarrassing things that happened to me with accent was I had this team member in India who had a very strong accent. He's from a state called Kerala. And Kerala, the accent is really pronounced. And when we were on conference calls, I couldn't understand him at all. And my American client had to translate and tell me what he was telling. And that was the most embarrassing time of mine. All right, so we have can we switch to our main slides, please? Yeah. We're going to come to his, it's just the third presentation.
Oh, he's there.
Yep. So this afternoon we have a very interesting group of people here. I think tremendous amount of cross-border experience and a good mix of both legal and accounting professionals and CEOs. So what I'll do is we'll start with quick introductions and I'll ask each one of them to say a little something about themselves. And then we'll come back to our slides. Shahid, you want to go first? Quick introduction.
Sure. So my name is Shahid Chirania. I'm a managing director for emerging markets for Equifax. We define emerging markets slightly differently. Typically, it does not include Brazil and any of the Latin countries for us because we already have a presence. So I really manage all of Asia, Eastern Europe, and Australia, New Zealand, about 45 some countries.
Thank you. Rajesh?
Yeah, my name is Rajesh Tripathi. I'm part of Grant Thornton family for last 18 months, and the role I play for Grant Thornton is I'm the financial tax leader, focusing on U.S. India corridor, basically looking at our U.S. clients, companies who want to go to India or operating in India, how we can help them from a tax audit advisory perspective, and also look at Indian companies coming into the U.S., how we can hold their hand and help them on the tax audit advisory side or M&A transaction.
Okay. Ambrish?
Well, hi everyone, and thanks for being here today on a rainy day. I'm Ambrish Vaisiwala. I'm the CEO of Open Holdings, which is a real estate company based out of Atlanta. So we do commercial and residential ground-up developments. The US is China, India, and South Korea. That's where our current footprint is.
Thank you. Philip?
Last, which is appropriate for the only lawyer in the panel. My name is Phil Thompson. I am, as of 2 days ago, the senior partner in the corporate practice group of a relatively small firm in Atlanta, Moore Ingram. Prior to that, I was the chair of the international practice group in 4 AmLaw 100 firms, Philadelphia, DC, and 2 in Atlanta, one of which I started out my career representing Portman Properties, but that's another story. I appreciate your invite, and I'm glad to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. And quick note about myself. I was a victim of cross-border transactions. Right? I was running a business in India, and India went into trouble, needed foreign exchange. So my board said, go to the US and send some dollars home. And so I landed up here first time ever in a foreign country, started a business, and learned my way, and then got into mergers and acquisitions. And I now run a company. We do mergers and acquisitions, especially cross-border transactions. Yeah, so we have a tremendously experienced panel, and so we'll just look at some of the themes we will cover today. If you can go to the next slide, please. Sorry. Next one. Next one. Yeah, great. So we look at, from a business viewpoint, the globalization is here to stay. We see tremendous amount of cross-border activity going on, and it affects companies in tremendous ways. Organizational structures, processes that are working in one may not work in another. So how do you adapt? And today's panel, we will be addressing several of these themes. How do we handle personnel policy? What may be legal in one place is not legal in another. So how do you build an organization that spans markets at the same time? How do you put together policies that are sensitive to different markets? Compensation structures. A good friend of mine here in Atlanta used to run Rolls-Royce USA. And his biggest problem used to be that Rolls-Royce, his parent company in the UK, was a very industrial company, whereas Rolls-Royce here was a very sales and marketing oriented company. And here they were free to spend because they were typically entertaining customers, traveling first class, staying at Four Seasons. They had a very luxurious life. Whereas this chap's boss in the UK, who was the general manager there, was bound by some very traditional industrial type personnel policies, right? So when he came here, he could only stay at the Motel 6 because that's what his budget allowed him. And so it was a very interesting situation with Rolls-Royce, where the US subordinate used to travel first class, his boss used to sit in the back of the plane, the US subordinate used to stay at Four Seasons, and this poor boss used to stay at Motel 6. Now, these are some of the types of issues with cross-border transactions. Legal, insurance, compliance. And then whenever you do transactions, be it an investment, be it a joint venture, be it an acquisition or a sale, what changes market to market in terms of deal structure, in terms of the regulatory frameworks, political considerations sometimes, right? Due diligence. We'll be talking about some of the, each market, in fact, some of the markets we'll be talking about today will be India and China, and of course, contrasting that with the US. Looking at due diligence, looking at antitrust issues, anti-corruption legislation. These are all pretty complex subjects whenever we get into cross-border transactions. And last, tax. From a business strategy viewpoint, sometimes companies have, rude surprises. Day before yesterday, I was in India, and we went to Krispy Kreme to buy some donuts for our nieces, right? We all love Krispy Kreme donuts. And when we gave the donuts to our nieces, they said, we asked them, so which is better, Dunkin' Donuts or Krispy Kreme? Because both operate in India. And they said, Dunkin' Donuts has the best burgers in town. So go figure, right? So products tend to get accepted in a very different fashion in different markets. Yep. So some of the common mistakes we will talk about in this session include, making wrong assumptions, right? Communication confusion, all the drama about brand names being translated into something else. Yeah, Chevy Nova is a great example. Nova doesn't go. Yeah. Loss of trust, negotiations that take forever, and the speed you expect in one market doesn't apply to the other. Planning for siesta time, for example. Hidden decision makers, not knowing who's the boss and what is the political structure inside an organization. Looking at issues around confidentiality, business changes, shareholder conflict. Each one of these dimensions takes on a completely new life when we're looking at cross-border transactions. And of course, when does a negotiation end? In some markets, never. Even after you sign the contracts, you will still be negotiating. Loss of momentum, discomfort in dealing with ambiguity. Not getting a clear answer is fine in some markets, not fine in some other markets. So in today's panel, we'll be picking up many of these issues. So let me first start with the Shahid to, the structure we will follow is each one of them will spend 5 to 7 minutes just talking about their experiences in cross-border transactions and cross-border investments. And then we will, after each one of them finishes, we will pick up questions from the audience. If you guys are quiet, then I'll have to unleash some questions on them. Okay? Shahid.
Thanks, Madhu. So instead of calling it challenges, I would say opportunities when we look at cross-border transaction. Typically, when you do merger and acquisition, there's, I put them in 3 buckets. You do the due diligence, assuming you have your business strategies and everything. Then you have the negotiation and the integration. And I'll touch on a few items under each of the buckets that often becomes very challenging and time-consuming when you're doing this M&A cross-border transaction. So in terms of due diligence, there's always a question is, have you spent enough time? My opinion is whenever you're doing an international transaction, there's never enough time spent on due diligence. Because there's always something you will find out either during a negotiation or integration, or even further down when you're doing some other business strategy or a year or 2 later. So I would highly recommend that you spend disproportionate time in due diligence because, depending on the experience of your organization, if this is the first time you're dealing with certain country or certain time of segments and whatnot, cultural differences alone will cause a humongous amount of misunderstanding as you're going through what you want to look for during the due diligence. The other part that often people either don't spend enough time or don't give serious thoughts are around regulations and tax implication. I won't go a lot into tax implication because we have experts here who can talk more about it. But in terms of regulation, depending on which country you're dealing with, which segment within the country you're dealing with, it has limitations to what you can or cannot do. And again, often people look at that on a very high level and say, I can go in this country, I want to do the insurance product, or I want to do a financial services product, and because of what I do in US or other parts of the world, I can deploy it here as well. And what you find out is often, because of certain regulation, you can't do that. Everybody knows the famous example of Walmart, right? Walmart went to India, tried to do it, and they did it for many years, and after that, they decided to exit, right? And if you drill down into it, a lot of it is to do with the way regulation was. A lot of insurance companies, when they go to other parts of the world, they run into the same issues. So understanding the tax implication and the regulatory implication, and not just what you can and cannot do, but also from an employee perspective as well. There are a lot of countries where you have to deal with union, where you have to do with certain labor laws and whatnot that either will impact negatively, not often positively, but mostly negatively, what kind of synergies you can do, what kind of things you can do from an employee perspective as well. Financial is the other part. And I would say financial and foreign investment. Again, there are a tremendous amount of challenges depending on which country you're dealing with, whether you can get your funds out of the country, and even if you want to get out of the country, there are certain regulations that you have to follow whereby which you can get the funds out of the country. Financials. I can almost tell you any developing country you're dealing with, if you're trying to do an M&A transaction, there's always 2 books, if not 3 or 4.
You're all familiar with 2 books, right?
Right. Again, it is, we take it lightly, or as a companies that we operate in the US, we feel that is not the case, but I can almost guarantee you, I have done over 50 transactions in Asia, in Latin and other places. Every single transaction, as I said, I had 2, maybe 3 books. So you should be very, very careful looking at what the financial implications are and how you want to structure it. A little bit about negotiation, Madhu alluded to earlier. Certain parts of the world, especially in Asia, negotiation never ends. Even when you think when you have a signed contract, you're still negotiating. Some parts of LATAM, they don't believe in negotiation on a paper. They will do verbal negotiation, and they will say that is the deal. Until you put something on a paper, and then you find out that that was not the deal that you had. We had situations where at the last minute, when we were transferring the funds, they came back and said, oh, by the way, we want one more condition to be added to our proposal. So negotiation in some parts of the world never ends. Also, in developed countries, we're quite used to doing negotiation over phones, on video conferencing, on audio conferencing. Again, most of the developing countries, you have to be face-to-face. There is no such thing as, if you think you're making progress, sitting doing negotiation on a voice calls or audio calls, you are not. Because when you reach to the end, what you'll find out that you're still talking about the point number one that you discussed, weeks or days or months ago. Cultural differences, a huge impact across the board, whether it's due diligence, whether it's negotiation, whether it's integration. You should clearly understand the country you're trying to do business in. Yes never always means yes, and no doesn't always mean no. Maybe means something else. I suppose, quite honestly, they all have different meanings when you're talking to them. So cultural understanding is extremely, extremely important. And just the last few items on integration. Don't wait too long to integrate, because often you will find out during the integration phase that the assumptions you made, either due diligence or your business strategies or in a negotiation, how good they are. So I would highly encourage you to do integration quickly. And when I say integration, I don't necessarily mean go in, fire everybody who's locally and put in your management, because that does not work. I'm a big fan of letting management run the team on the ground, run the way they are running. Yes, you need to bring some oversight, corporate governance, make sure that they're following your rules and regulation, but let the management run the way they're running. And again, make sure you integrate quickly. Financial flow and accounting. US GAAP, again, there's experts here who can talk more about it, but the way they recognize the revenue, the way they recognize expenses, and all of the above, it is significantly different in some other parts of the world. So clearly understand what are you asking management, local management to do from a financial perspective, what your accountabilities are, versus the way you expect to do the business in US. And the last thing I would say is international venture always consume disproportionate time. Again, I have done multiple acquisitions. I have spoken to quite a few people, and every single person I speak to, they say that international ventures always take a disproportionate time compared to when you do acquisition in US.
Great, thank you. So with that, I think we'll switch to the next piece, which is Rajesh. We get
Slide deck because I'll just talk more on the tax
fine.
and so as Shahid mentioned, that whenever you do any kind of international acquisition, the domestic acquisitions are always easy, but working with international acquisitions, especially with India. So I'm going to be focused on India right now. It's always a challenge. It's always an issue with working with India because of the cultural things, because of the language that people speak. And the biggest challenge is because India is spread between 27 states, and every state has their own ways of doing things. Language is a barrier. So whenever you do any acquisition or working with India on any acquisition deal, you got to be very careful that you do your due diligence. And what is the definition of due diligence? Going out and understanding that what is their books of accounts that they are managing. As Shahid said, 2 books of accounts or maybe 3 books of accounts they're managing. So make sure that you go through and look at each books of accounts that they have. Ask them repeatedly. and make sure you convert that to US GAAP and see how it's impacting your US operation. That's the first thing you got to look into. Then make sure that you ask for the tax returns that they're filing. How the tax returns have been filed. Have they missed out on any tax returns? Because after you acquire a company in India, and then 3 years down the road, the tax authorities in India send you a notice that, hey, you missed out on a tax return, and you get into any litigation in India, mind you, that litigation is going to go on for 10 to 12 years, 15 years. So whenever you do any acquisitions in India, make sure that you do the due diligence on the tax return as well. Have they filed the tax returns? Have they paid the taxes in India? Whether it's direct tax, indirect tax. Have they done the transfer pricing? The reporting of transfer pricing has been done correctly or not in India. So that's from the due diligence perspective. What happens when you do an acquisition where you're focused on investing money into India, or you're acquiring a company and you have to fund money from the US? You got to make sure that you get the proper FIPP approval. That's the RBI runs. RBI is the Reserve Bank of India that basically monitors any funds that enter India and exits out. So you got to make sure that you are compliant with the regulations of RBI when any funds are getting into India. The moment you send money from here and you categorize that as an equity, and down the road if you say no, that's going to be a loan from my related party entity in India, the RBI is going to monitor that and they're going to levy penalty, and the penalties are significantly high. So make sure that any acquisition, when the wire transfer of the money is pumped into India, you monitor or work with the right people to get the approval from the RBI. What happens when you are acquiring a company in India or doing any M&A transaction and you have to deal with the treaties? Because tax is one of the big issues. That when you do any transaction or acquire a company in India, and the tax treaty between US and India is going to rule that if you're bringing money back from India back into the US to your whole parent company in the US, what kind of withholding taxes are going to be levied by the Indian tax authorities? That's very, very crucial. As you, one thing I will mention that anytime there's a cash being repatriated back from India. So let's take an example that US parent company has a subsidiary in India. And the subsidiary in India has significant cash that now the US company says, I want the cash back, to be sent because I need the cash into the US. India, the moment the cash leaves the Indian territory and it comes to the US, India is going to levy you a dividend distribution tax of 16.995%. That is in addition to the 30% tax that they have already levied on that income. So you're looking at about 43–44% of tax that you got to pay in India. So you got to make sure that whenever you're doing any acquisition, you do proper tax planning. Legal is one aspect, but tax is a significant aspect whenever you're doing the acquisition. Make sure that the treaty, somebody reads the treaty correctly between US and India, or maybe look at having a holdco company in between. Do proper planning on how you have to acquire the company in India, whether you should set up a holding company in Singapore or set up a company in any other jurisdiction where US has a very good treaty network so that you can mitigate your withholding taxes. Because at the end of the day, if you're going to be paying 50–60% tax by the time the money reaches back to the US, is it a worthwhile, significant business deal that you want to do? You don't want to. So make sure that the tax planning is done up front. Whenever any due diligence or acquisition you guys are doing, you do the due diligence, but the tax planning has to be comprised along with that. You will have the legal team, the lawyers working on the legal documents. You'll have the finance team working on the due diligence, but is somebody looking at the tax side as well? So that is a very crucial thing. Getting into India, setting up operations in India is getting much easier now, which was difficult 5 or 7 years ago. With the new government, Mr. Modi, who's our new Prime Minister who came into power last year, he's opening up the doors for foreign companies to come and invest money in India. He's making it simpler. He's trying to see that a foreign company can come and set up a company in India within 48 hours. That is his goal, but it's going to take time to change that and come up with the regulations to change. You can set up an operation or you can acquire a company in India. There are different ways that you can do a tax-free acquisition in India. Or you could set up different ways of either setting up a wholly owned subsidiary or a branch or a JV in India. There are ways that you can get into the Indian market. But the key thing, whenever you do any kind of M&A transaction, due diligence is one aspect, but tax is equally important, and transfer pricing. Right now, transfer pricing is becoming a key thing for under the OECD and BEPS rule. every company has to look at your transfer price. When you do any acquisition, you're doing any intercompany transaction of loans or services with that related party outside US, you have to look at transfer price. Because not only the US, but foreign countries are also making sure they do comply with the transfer pricing regulation. So tax is a key thing in addition to the legal documentation and due diligence. So make sure the taxes are addressed along with your acquisition or anything that you guys are doing with foreign countries.
Thanks, Rajesh. Amrish, you want to share your experience of having done, investments in China, India, and I think maybe also a little bit about how Portman's personality is known in China versus here versus India, almost like 3 different views of the company.
Yeah, happy to chat about it. So I, just by way of background, Portman is basically an Atlanta-based real estate company started by John Portman. We were the first foreign real estate company to go into China back in 1982, just as the market had opened. We went into India in 1998, again way before the market opened. We've done developments in Hong Kong and Singapore, but we don't have an office there anymore, also in Europe. We've looked at deals in Turkey and South America and Australia, but really our focus now is the US and China, India and South Korea. In fact, really narrower than that. Can I just ask, anyone here from China? Okay, great. And South Korea? Okay. Just want to make sure I don't get beaten up for saying the wrong thing. And I know the Indians who are from India. So, my comments are really just some general observations from investing capital in real estate around the world. Are you having difficulty hearing me?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay. If I may not be able to speak loud enough, so I just move if it's an issue. But and I think Shahid and Raj had some great observations about this. So really, from our perspective, the first sort of question I really look at when we invest capital internationally is why do you want to go overseas? And I think there's a general notion that I find that people think, oh, it's better out there. And the reality is that if you're going in some other market, it's as competitive. There are local factors and there are local considerations. And because we may not be fully aware of what may be happening on the ground doesn't mean that it's a very rosy situation out there. And it's amazing just how overlooked that factor is. Why are you going overseas? And if you get past that, the other issue is real estate or overseas investments generally are a marathon, they're not a sprint. It takes time, you need to have the reserves and the capital to go through it. You generally do a few deals where you learn, at least in our business, and then you kind of go on and it's a real business, or you may not go on beyond the one deal. So you just need to be prepared for something like that. And that's something we've kind of learned the hard way doing business around the world. What we found consistently is that who we do business with is far more important than anything else. So there has to be a counterparty to our deals that we can trust, that we can have a dialogue with, that's going to be honest and straightforward. And things in business never go in a straight line. There's always going to be issues. And in our deals, when we look at setting out deals which might take 5 to 8 years before we exit, in some cases 30 years, you need to have a partner or a group of people that you're doing business with that you can sit down and you can have discussions and conversations when things go wrong. In our history of doing business, we've never had litigation generally with partners that we have initiated. So we've always sat down and worked things out, and that's very, very important. The other thing that we find from the point of view of our business is that in what we do, there's sort of a continuum for us from sort of acquiring land to eventually doing construction to having a finished asset to operating this asset and then to selling it and making our money. And there's a process involved all the way through of looking at the market, understanding the market, doing your underwriting, due diligence, looking at how you acquire land, how you construct, how you operate, how you exit, how you take money in, how you take money out. And it's different across different countries. And so I wouldn't say that any one market is easier or harder. Along that continuum, there are points in that process where the US is a very difficult market and China and India might be very easy markets. And there are other points in that process where, you know, it might be the reverse of that. And so from our point of view, one of the things that we learned the hard way very early is that if people were to consider the real cost of going offshore, a lot of people would never do it because it's very, very expensive, and that initial investment that one makes in setting up a market generally does not get recovered. That's a write-off against market entry. And so we were looking at a lot of countries around the world, and we've basically now consolidated really to the US, India, and China. And our view is that those are markets with a GDP and a population that's going to sustain for a very long period of time. We think there'll be three lead economies globally for the next 40, 50 years, whether they go up or down. And we don't want to be in a position where we have to go back and relearn the lesson every time and rebuild our networks and rebuild our relationships. So there has to be a way that you can scale up and sustain and replicate and have a program to what the business is. So that's kind of been our approach to it. So just some general observations from my point of view, that's all I have.
Thanks. We'll switch to a legal perspective now, quite different from, I guess, the other three. So Phil, you want to share some of the aspects of, what changes from a legal perspective as you move from one market to another?
Thank you very much. To put things in perspective, actually, Shahid did a very good job of talking about the general parameters of what you do before you buy a company in the U.S. or before U.S. business invests in a company abroad. The term due diligence is always interesting to me because I'm not sure I could tell you what the derivation of due diligence is. But let me put things in perspective. I moved here in 1974, which makes me the oldest person in the room. And as a young lawyer, my first major account was Portman Properties. And to put Atlanta in perspective, everything that John Portman had built at that time was in the center of Atlanta, Peachtree City. And the first foreign project he did was when he built a hotel in New York City. So the world's changed quite a bit over that period of time. The topic of cross-border investments, cross-border mergers and acquisitions, is to put it in perspective, in the ABA, I'm an active member of the international section and the M&A section of the ABA. It is a 2 to 3 day seminar that goes on with hundreds of speakers and presentations, and even then you were just beginning to touch upon the basic issues. So I'm glad that we don't have Dr. Gowan, the person running the show, that talks about 5 slides in 7 minutes. I mean, that's not a challenge. It's sort of I don't know what you would call it. But let me anecdotally go over a couple things. This is not a typical lawyer approach. I'm also an adjunct professor in business school, so I'm going to go about it a different way. Talk about China for a second, where I have not that much experience. But if you look at statistics from 2003 until now, in 2003 there was zero, in effect, foreign direct investment in the U.S. and there was several billions of dollars of investment by the U.S. in China. That has totally, those curves have crossed. Foreign direct investment by China in the U.S. now exceeds that of the U.S. and China. There are lots of reasons for that. Here's an interesting statistic. Of the EB-5 visas for foreign investors, in 2014, 90% of the EB-5 visas granted in the U.S. were to Chinese citizens. So if you look at that, the increase of foreign direct investment from all over the world in the U.S. or the U.S. abroad has changed dramatically over that period of time. If you go to the slides This is a lot of this Shahid touched upon, but let's go to the next slide. This is a corporate compliance matrix. I don't want to say I authored it. It's from an ABA course material on how you look at issues that come up in cross-border transactions. And the panelists have already touched upon this. If you're coming, this is for an inbound transaction where there's going to be an acquisition of a U.S. business. First, you have to understand domestic United States regulatory issues. Those would be issues that deal with a particular type of industry, like food and drug industry. Then you have to look at multi-jurisdictional international regulatory issues. I'll touch upon that in a moment. And then you go down into the details of these regulations. There are regulations involving industry sectors. There's anti-terrorism regulations, which has increased dramatically since 9/11. We'll talk about that in a second. There are corporate governance regulations, Sarbanes-Oxley, 2002, data privacy security laws. That's a very hot topic, proliferation of that. And then you get into the specifics of the different types of formats that you can use for direct investment. It can be just a direct investment. It can be a joint venture, strategic alliance, as Portman would do often. It can be an acquisition of assets. It can be an acquisition of stock. It can be a merger of companies. There are many different formats. They all have different effects on the due diligence and the regulatory regimes that you have to deal with. The next slide, please. Let's look at what you have to consider coming into the U.S. That right there is a list of the basic laws that you have to deal with if you're considering coming into the United States. And those laws are overseen by every major regulatory regime in the U.S., everything from Department of State, Commerce, Treasury, all the way through to the Office of the President, POTUS. And it is an absolute maze of regulations. And but if you are going to come into the U.S., and it's not just public acquisitions, it's not just billion-dollar acquisitions, it can be a relatively small private acquisition, you have to be able to do your due diligence and understand what